Hello everyone. Today we'll be discussing the final part of our discussion on the presence of the Indian diaspora, and we'll be talking about their presence in the global south. Now, the presence of the diaspora in the global south and indeed the waves of migration that took them there, that made them settle in spaces outside the global north, is very different from the experiences of the global north. Because if we look at the migration of the diaspora to the global north before and after independence, it was basically because they believed that there were better opportunities outside, abroad for them. And this was a story for the global south as well. But the way that it happened is quite different, because for the global north, it was mostly a voluntary migration. It was a belief that, especially before independence, it was a belief that the Western education that had come to the elites in India due to the colonial system, that is essentially where they would have to migrate to gain the benefits of it, to understand that kind of education better. And of course, in the contemporary times, people migrate to the global north from India and settle there because they believe that there are better employment opportunities there, more freedom for research, better kinds of education, and a better life for their children. The story is slightly different from the global south. Now, the Indian government's involvement with the diaspora in the global south has been much slower than is acceptable, especially because the Indian government has focused on a generally remittance-based approach. That is until, of course, the Narendra Modi government that has been focusing on engaging with the Gamidia youth in the global south in order to bring them closer to the deep cultural links that he wants to them to have with the homeland. So besides that, the engagement with the diaspora in the global south has been lacking, and the reason for that is, of course, because of the fact that unlike the diaspora in the global north, unlike most of the diaspora in the global north, the diaspora in the global south is, number one, quite entrenched into the local communities. They have intermarried, they have settled there, they have sometimes attained citizenship, and they are not all affluent. They are mostly engaged in the rural sector or in the agricultural sector or in the industrial sector. So of course, it made more sense for the Indian government to first look at engaging with the diaspora in the global north. However, the diaspora in the global south is extremely numerous. They are extremely heterogeneous, very diverse, because of course India's population is that diverse, and they have consistently tried to act as a bridge between themselves, their host countries, and the culture that they remember. Now, in this talk, we'll be talking about the diaspora in Latin and Central America, and then we'll be talking about the diaspora in the Caribbean. Now, very little data exists about the diaspora that has moved to Latin and Central America. Data is quite scarce also about the reasons why there is some movement, and indeed the diaspora in this region is quite limited. It's not a very powerful or a very influential or a very big group in fact. So if we talk about certain examples, we can begin with how in the mid-19th century, a lot of the Indian indentured laborers, they arrived in Panama to build the Panama Railways and the Panama Canal. And then of course they married and settled into these societies. The same can be said about Belize, or what was then known as British Honduras, which essentially was a British colony. So again, for the plantation economies or for the sugar plantations, Indians in indentured labor were transported from India to work in those places. And as I said, indeed, now they compose 5% of the population. Various technical agreements have been signed, such as the India Economic and Technical Cooperation Agreement, which was signed in 1995 and 1996. And there is some amount of technical cooperation that occurs between these two countries. Then if we, for example, talk about Chile, a very small population of Indians. However, there are statues of Mahatma Gandhi that are especially centered around Santiago. Then we'll talk about, for example, Venezuela, where again the small population of Indians who are either businessmen or engaged in the retail business, or they are engaged in agriculture, or they are professionals. All of these individuals have eventually led to the formation of a Cathedra Libre, or a chair of Indian thought, in the National University in Venezuela, in Caracas, which essentially talks about the thought of Mahatma Gandhi. Then if we talk about Peru, for example, Peru and India have a long-standing Peru-India Friendship Agreement, which essentially allows them to have several bilateral agreements on trade, on cooperation, on culture, on the exchange of IT, for example. Then, of course, there is a variety of other countries also in Latin America and Central America, like Guatemala, for example, where Indians do not need a visa to enter, which also was a plantation economy under the British, where a lot of Indian indentured laborers had come and settled as well. Now, when we talk about the rapidly rising economies in this region of the world, which is essentially Mexico and Brazil, we also have to understand that their relationship with India is extremely long-standing, and one of the biggest reasons behind that is, of course, because Brazil, Mexico and India do share a lot of similarity in their problems that they are encountering, whether it be in terms of poverty, whether it be in terms of drugs and narcotics trafficking, which of course is much higher in Mexico, but the problems do remain in India. Human trafficking, for example, a completely rising population, a rapidly growing economy. So India and Brazil, of course, are involved together in the BRICS, which essentially is Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. They also have a trade monitoring mechanism which allows them to have a lot of long-standing bilateral agreements on civil defense, infrastructure, agriculture, industry and any other allied sectors as well. Brazil and India are also part of the IPSA trilateral, which is the India, Brazil and South Africa trilateral. They're also part of the BASIC, which is the Brazil, South Africa, India and China agreement, which is an informal grouping which allows them to discuss any environment related issues. So of course, ever since India has signed the India-Mercosur trade agreement, and Mercosur is a Central American and Latin American based trading bloc, there are of course opportunities for Indian and Latin American and Central American trade to be diversified beyond just basic exports and imports. In Mexico, for example, the Mexican government has completely understood that the Indian IT sector is rapidly booming. The number of Indian IT professionals who are qualified in their fields, who are essentially bringing revolutionary change to their fields, has obviously amazed the Mexican government. So what they are attempting to do is also to attract a lot of Indians into Mexico, a lot of IT professionals, IT companies like Wipro into Mexico to essentially set up their factories there, and Indians of course migrate there because in the entire path of circular migration, Mexico brings them closer to the global north. It brings them closer to America than would India, for example. Then of course there is a lot of interest in Indian spiritualism, Indian religion and Indian culture. There are several ISKCON, Satya Sai Baba, Radha Krishna, all of these temples and ashrams are set up all around Latin and Central America. Another booming area in which India and Latin and Central America they are cooperating is in the medicinal industry, because a lot of pharmaceutical companies such as Ranbaxy or IPCO have set up their laboratories there due to low operating costs. So essentially, India needs to engage with its diaspora in Latin and Central America much more concentratedly. This is difficult, of course, because the diaspora is not very numerous. It is quite scarce, and those that are there have essentially, as I said, quite assimilated into the Indian population. But of course, as the Modi government has realized, like in this area, as for the Caribbeans, the engagement of the Indian population or engagement with the Indian diaspora, or as now with the descendants of the Indian diaspora, is extremely important because they can serve as the informal ambassadors for India and that in these regions. Now, if we talk about the Caribbeans, the history is much more interesting in the way that there is a lot more research and a lot more information about it. So the article I have spoken to you about specifically about Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana and Suriname. Now, essentially what I'll be talking to you about now is just a basic understanding of what exactly happened and why the Indian diaspora, so many scores of the Indian diaspora, they migrated to the Caribbeans. So now under the British colonial rule, there was something called the indenture system. So their plantations, the British plantations or French plantations or Dutch plantations in the Caribbean, they originally used to use slave labor. 95% of the population at that place before slave labor was abolished, essentially was populated by slaves. Now after slave labor was abolished in the colonies, there suddenly was a huge labor shortage, and the various colonial masters started to import labor from the nearby spaces, from elsewhere in the Caribbean, from Latin and Central America, from Africa, but this was not enough. So then the British government entered into various agreements with the receiving governments to send laborers under the indenture system from India. So these laborers essentially, especially from the Bhojpuri speaking districts, from the Calcutta hinterlands, from Bombay, for example, from all of these places, these laborers essentially would have to wait for weeks at the depot. Then they would undertake a long and strenuous journey where most would die of malaria and cholera because, of course, the hygiene conditions weren't good at all. And they would finally land up in the plantations. Then they would have to essentially sign a contract for 5 years, which could be extended to 10 years. And if after the completion of the contract, they would be afforded and they would be allowed a subsidized or free passage back home. Now, to mediate and regulate all these migrant flows, various coolie ordinances were released by the British Indian government, and various agreement settlement policies were also made with the receiving countries. Now, when these laborers were coming, they faced extremely exploitative and extremely hard conditions. The journey, as I said, was extremely hard. When they reached, they were exploited. They were essentially kept in slavish conditions. Yes, there were officials who were appointed to look after their rights and to inform them about the risks of the indentureship that they were signing. But of course, these plantation owners, because they were racially and class-wise and ethnically closer to the colonial masters, of course, their interest was the colonial masters and profit, and not the indentured laborers at all. These laborers coming from India were not allowed to acclimatize to the climate of the places that they were going to. So, of course, many of them died in that as well. Even so, after their contracts ended, only 1/3 of them chose to remigrate back to India. The rest of them settled into communities. They married, they created their own villages, they stayed in the rural sector, slowly moving into the retail and manufacturing sector. Why is this? Now, the main reason behind this is that when they came from India, they're essentially, in general, they were lower caste Hindus and Muslims who were coming. What they were escaping in India was a lot of economic deprivation, a lot of social ostracism, and an absolute lack of any opportunities for social upward mobility. So, regardless of whatever promises was made to them, and for example, Suriname was miscommunicated to them as Sriram to give it a religious flavor, to attract more indentured laborers to come. All of these things, the difficult journeys, the slavish conditions that they endured when they went there, all of these paled in comparison to what they felt that what they were leaving behind, because they felt that a relatively freer future awaited them in the Caribbean. And after the end of their indentureship, after the end of their contracts, the attractive settlement policies that were promulgated by whether the Dutch government or the British government, that would allow them to acquire some land, to allow them to have certain different means of employment and livelihood, such as getting into cane farming, for example. This seemed like a better life to them, because when they crossed the Kalapani, which is essentially the ocean, to get to the Caribbeans, they knew that when they would get home, they would have to endure even more social ostracism. So for them, it essentially just made more sense to stay where they had come, because they could not fit back in India. Even some that returned to India again came back to the Caribbeans, either looking for more contracts or looking to settle in those spaces again. And then in Guyana, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Suriname, they infiltrated into the local population, they intermarried, and they essentially settled there. Now, of course, there are second, third and fourth generation Indian diaspora who identify as Guyanese or Surinamese or East Hindustanis or any things like this. And of course, they have a very complicated history of ties to what they feel that their homeland is. And in fact, the Know Your India program that has been facilitated by the Modi government to get in touch with the Girmitya youth is just to essentially remind them that regardless of where their parents were born or where they were born, their diasporic connections remain with India itself. So essentially, this is the entire story of the Indian diaspora as they migrated to the Caribbeans. Now, of course, they form a significant majority of the population in the Caribbeans, and they have held important political and economic and social roles, and they play these roles, they contribute to the economy. Now they own businesses, they employ people, they contribute to their host country's GDP. So of course, the Indian diaspora in the global south is extremely important as well. Now, to the Caribbeans, newer sort of immigration has started to take place. This essentially is a kind of circular immigration where for Indians seeking a better future abroad, the kind of exposure and international presence that the Caribbeans or Latin or Central America would afford them essentially causes them to migrate to these places first as one of its first ports of call, after which they migrate or they look to migrate to the global north, whether it be Canada, UK or the USA. So this new wave of extremely skilled and highly professional Indians that are coming in, they don't generally come in to the Caribbeans or to Latin or Central America or anywhere in the global south with the intention of settling there. Essentially, this is a kind of, as I said, circular migration, where this is one of many ports of call that would allow them to gain better opportunities in the USA or elsewhere in the global north. So the job of the Indian government, or the imperative of the Indian government, it would be to engage with the Indian diaspora in the global south more, because not only Are they a wonder house or a powerhouse of opportunities for better cooperation, for better ties between India and these regions? And these ties are not very well explored at all. And these regions are powerhouses of resources. It would also bring these people who have managed to keep their cultural links alive much closer to their homeland.